and that is going to be able to actually ensure us that we're actually talking about a process. When we're able to say that this condition about empires is going to be give us a result, this condition of the world about capitalists and about great companies ruling the world, but great companies ruling the world cannot give us a result again great empires ruling the world. It cannot be, because these great companies go beyond a nation, and these empires are about nations, so we cannot go back. That is very important, and that condition is going to be truly going to be able to tell you that you are talking about a process in time. When you're able to fulfill this condition, that you can be sure that you're talking about a temporal process. So now let's go back a bit into some theory. As we were telling, we're starting with Middle Ages. This is where we're going to be studying the first part of the trimester, and again, I know that I have said this many times, but you have to take into consideration that it depends on what you're studying. The same thing can result in several outcomes. So it all depends on the scope that you are taking, on the approach that you are taking, the results that you are going to have. So do not worry if you have seen this several times. Trust me, you want to see it again. So from the 5th century, we have already said that the 5th century marks the fall of Rome, and up to the 9th century, we're going to have the early Middle Ages, and in the 9th century, we're going to start with the Viking intrusions and the start of the feudal institutions, and from that point up to the 15th century, with the fall of Constantinople, we're going to have the late Middle Ages. But what is the meaning of this division? Because we have said, and this is why this is important, and it is different than the way that we have seen this, because we have seen that the century is the unit of analysis of history. The 5th century, the 6th century, the 7th century, the 8th century, and the 9th century. Those are the unit of analysis of history. But then why are we grouping all these 5 centuries into a broader group called early Middle Ages? And from the 9th to the 15th century, we're grouping them into a broader group called late Middle Ages. Why is that? And that has something to do with theory about history, and you already know this because we have studied this the first trimester. But now you're going to be able to actually apply it and actually understand what it is talking about. What it is talking about. So. I have seen the books that you're going to be having the next year, the books of history that you're going to be having on second grade. And they actually talk about these time durations, and that is really good because usually books do not talk about the durations of history. But the thing is that they are not going to tell you who was the author about about the theory of the durations of history, and that is important. It was Fernand Braudel, and remember that he was the guy that continued with the ideas of Marc Bloch after Marc Bloch died in the Second World War, fighting the Nazis. Remember that he was captured and he was executed. So this guy continued with his ideas, and it is Fernand Braudel, and he's going to propose these durations of history. And we have seen this in the first part of the year, the first trimester. So you may very well go back to that point in your notes, and you will find more or less these same definitions. Remember that the short duration of history is the time of men. So over here we can make history about all the transformations that went by because of Napoleon, and Napoleon is going to be just the life of one guy. It is just about the lifespan of Napoleon, and that is going to be the short duration. We're just talking about events that are going to happen during the lifetime of one person. But over here, usually, well, of course, if you are working in a biography, you are going to be dealing with this type of duration, But usually in history, as remember that we're talking about social processes, we're going to be focusing in the other two durations of history: the middle duration, or the medium duration, and the long duration. And what are those durations? Well, the middle or medium duration is going to be the conjunctural time. What is the conjunctural time? Well, it talks about the transformation. A conjunctural time is the time precisely in which institutions, for example, are going to be changing. So usually the century is going to be this middle or medium duration, but the long duration is the structural time. So the structural time is something a bit more complex, or quite more complex, because we're not going to be seeing just a simple process in which things are going to be changing. We're going to see the transformation of the whole structures of societies, and that is quite complex because structure is something that usually by definition doesn't change, and you require very particular definitions on structure that will allow you to think that the structures may change. Because, for example, according to Levi-Strauss, you remember Levi-Strauss? We're studying him in geography. Well, according to Levi-Strauss, structures actually never change, and that is the condition for something to be a structure. But that is just Levi-Strauss. Many guys that came after him actually gave us the conditions for structures to change, and precisely this grouping of centuries, this grouping about having early Middle Ages and late Middle Ages, is going to be talking about the long duration. Do you remember that we actually said the first trimester that when you have more or less 3, 4, 5 centuries, you can actually be talking now about the long duration and not anymore about the medium or middle duration. And that is precisely why, because remember, over here we're saying we have the fall of the Western Empire, and then we're going to have this that is going to be very particular. Well, yes, the incursions of the Vikings that are going to transform all Europe and are going to change Britain and are going to change France and are going to change all those countries that are going to enter into the proper feudal ages, not only the Middle Ages but the feudal ages. And precisely that, we have the birth of the feudal institutions, and that is why we have a picture of Charlemagne over here. So in here we're going to have these big structural transformations going from the Roman times to the birth of the feudal institutions and up to the end of all those structures with the birth of the modern ages. And we're going to be seeing that in the from the 15th and 16th century, we're going to be seeing the birth of the modern ages with the discoveries of America and the discoveries of the lower part of Africa. That is going to also cause great transformations in the structures of society and of the whole world. So over there we can be talking about the long duration. So that is why we also have this classification of the Middle Ages between the early and the late Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages itself is a concept thought within the long duration, because it is obviously the transformation from all these ancient cultures that were ruled in a particular way as the Greek cultures and as the Roman culture, and now we're going to enter this period in which everything is going to be different than it was in the Roman times, and more with more depth. In here in the late Middle Ages, everything is going to be quite different than in the Roman times. Over here in the early Middle Ages, societies are still going to try to look like Rome. And of course, Rome is never going to disappear from the mind of societies. Rome is always going to be a goal, something that societies want to be. Even Mussolini in the 20th century wanted to rebuild Rome, and this is 15 centuries after the fall of Rome. Mussolini was still trying to bring the Roman Empire back to life. So of course, Rome is never going to disappear from the mind of people because it was such a great empire. But over here, the world is going to be quite different from the world that the Romans saw. Over here, perhaps it's still a bit similar, but over here, it is quite different. So also Middle Ages is going to be a concept thought within the long duration, within these long structural transformations that are going to take so long to happen. So let's start a bit with that. So let's start with this methodology that I am proposing to you of working with the characterization of each century. So if you remember, we stopped over here in class when we were still in school, and we were having in the 5th century division in the Roman Empire. We have the Western Roman Empire, that is all this red part, and then we have the Eastern Roman Empire, that is this purple part of the map. And they're going to be ruled by two cities, of course, Rome over here, that is this yellow dot, and Constantinople over here, that is this other yellow dot. So this is going to start, remember, in the 4th century, by the end of the crisis of the 3rd century, and it is going to be divided by Theodosius. So in order to understand how the 5th century started, because remember what we have to do to characterize 6th century, the first thing is that we have to know when it is the start of this century. When can we tell that this century actually starts? So in order to be able to tell when does the 5th century starts, we need to go back to some definitions that you already know quite well. First of all, this definition about the foedus. Remember that foedus is a Roman contract in which Romans would allow some other peoples to inhabit their territories in exchange for some rent, in exchange for something. Let's just say it like that. So from this foedus contract comes the word foederati, and the foederati are all these peoples that are going to be under the foedus contract. So all the peoples that are going to follow the foedus contract are going to be the foederati, and it is a plural because it is referred to several peoples, and not only peoples, but several peoples. So all the peoples that are going to be living under the foedus contract are going to be the foederati. And usually what they are going to do is that they are going to pay military services in exchange for living in the Roman territory. So by the 4th century, actually, the problem is that Rome has lost a lot of its power. So a lot of the military power that Rome still holds is due to the foederati. Rome is going to rely heavily on the power of all these peoples that were conquered by them, and well, not conquered, that are going to be offering their military services in exchange of living within its territory. So by the 4th century, a lot of the power of Rome will only be relying on the foederati, on all these peoples that are going to be inhabiting here. The other day I was reading again your book, and I read something that I actually liked a lot, and it is funny because I don't usually enjoy reading that book, but in this time I actually enjoyed something a lot, and I want us to go back again to the first trimester when we were talking about Machiavelli and Max Weber. Do you remember when we were talking about the state and the power of the state? And now I'm thinking a lot about Machiavelli, because remember that Signor Machiavelli used to say that the prince is the state. And according to your book, and I like this definition a lot because I was reading about the crisis of the 3rd century and everything, because, well, perhaps you'll know because we didn't study this really deep, because we were focusing on the ways of organization. But by the 3rd century, Rome went through a really bad crisis. Why? Because they had, again, several peoples making incursions into its territory, and the centralized power of the Romans was ending. The emperor was not able to hold the central power of the empire anymore. They weren't able to control the territory. All these wide territory, and the corruption was terrible, so they really lost control of the territory. And I really liked a lot what your book said, because it said that the empire had grown beyond the size of the emperor. So the emperor was small compared to the size of the empire, and that reminded me a lot of what Machiavelli said about how the prince is the state. So over here, as the prince was weak, the prince, he wasn't, yes, he may be thought of being as being weak, but the characterization of your book is quite well, because it is saying the empire is bigger than the prince. So if the prince is the state and the state becomes bigger than the prince, then remember that we have this problem in which Theodosius divides the state into two emperors, because the empire was already bigger than the emperor. So what your book says, I really enjoyed what your book says, because perhaps it is really truth. The empire had grown broader, bigger than the emperor himself. So what is going to happen? Well, as I was telling you, the um, the peoples that are going to be paying their services, their federati, are going to be relying